During the invasions of the 9th and 10th centuries, many castles were built for the protection of the people. These consisted usually of a wooden tower, several stories in height, surrounded by rude walls of wood or stone, and ditches. These became the homes of the feudal lords and the centres from which they ruled their fiefs. But they were exposed to constant danger from fire, especially in times of war. The suzerain who wished to conquer rebellious vassals burned their castles. William the Conqueror excelled in this mode of fighting. As the towers were of wood, they were rebuilt quickly and often reburned as quickly. Consequently, the nobles began to use stone in place of wood, and gradually the massive stone structures of the 12th and 13th centuries were evolved. In attacking a castle, the besieger relied chiefly upon siege engines or upon starving out the garrison. In building a castle, these two elements of danger determined its situation and method of construction. Siege engines could be used to best advantage only upon level, firm ground. Consequently, there were three favourite sites for castles: upon a cliff, difficult of approach as the Wartburg, upon an island as Chillon, or in the centre of a swamp where the surrounding ground was too soft for the heavy engines. If it was not possible to secure such natural advantages, the castle was surrounded by a moat, sometimes containing water, which would have to be filled up before the engines could approach the protecting walls. Frequently there were two or more walls, each one formed by building two parallel ramparts of stone a short distance apart, and filling in the space between with dirt dug from the moat. This made the wall more elastic and better able to withstand the blows from a battering ram. In the centre of one side there was a single gate. The approach was usually steep and wide enough for only one man. Before the gate there was a movable bridge across the moat, which was made especially deep at this point. In the 13th century, drawbridges came into use. The gate itself was flanked by two towers for the purpose of defence, as this was the most vulnerable point of the castle. At the entrance there was a portcullis, usually of massive timbers or of iron, which could be raised or lowered. Sometimes there was a second portcullis at the other end of the entrance, so that a storming party might be delayed and exposed to the crossfire of the defenders within the towers. Other towers were built at intervals projecting from the wall and a bow shot apart, so as to protect the intervening portions. Within the enclosure there were frequently other walls separating it into an outer and one or more inner portions, so as to make it difficult for an enemy to reach the actual stronghold. The various towers and other buildings were utilized for lodging and storage. But the most important parts of a large castle were the dungeon and keep. Because of an error made long ago, the two chief towers are confused in ordinary language, and dungeon and keep are used interchangeably. Consequently, we have formed a false impression of a castle. In this book, dungeon is used for the chief dwelling place, as it is used by German and French historians. Keep is used for the strong tower, which is called by the Germans Hauptturm, by the French Grand Tour or Maître Tour. Back to main text. The dungeon was the ordinary dwelling place of the knight and his family. The keep formed a place of refuge if the rest of the castle should be captured. The keep had no windows or doors on the first floor, and was entered by a movable ladder. In the lower story the treasures were stored and dangerous prisoners were confined. Within the enclosure there was always either a spring or wells, or at least a cistern for catching rainwater, so that the garrison need not suffer from thirst. If the enclosure was sufficiently large, it contained a garden for vegetables and herbs, a poultry yard, and buildings for other animals. The knights endeavoured to store up enough food to guard against starvation when besieged. The castle usually contained a chapel. Sometimes underground passages were built by which secret communication could be maintained with the country outside, and the garrison might escape in time of need. In some cases, as at Coucy, these were of great length. The owner of the castle was employed principally in managing his estate, in ruling his subjects, in hunting, and in fighting. The direction and government of an extensive fief required a large amount of time. In addition to the duties which now rest upon the holder of a similar property, the lord then had to administer justice, hold court, and police his domain. Hunting was a constant necessity, as this was one of the main sources of supply for the table. Fighting, above all else, was the occupation of the knight in the 10th and 11th centuries. The kings were usually engaged in struggles against rebellious barons. Private wars between nobles were incessant. The countries, especially France, were devastated by these wars, and the common people were reduced to the greatest extremities. Cannibalism was not infrequent in France about the year 1000. The Church, as usual, endeavoured to institute a reform. From 989 on, various councils in France decreed that anyone who used violence toward members of the clergy, women, peasants, or merchants should be excommunicated. This was called the Peace of God, but as its decrees were not heeded, the Church formed leagues of peace, which included individuals of all classes sworn to aid in maintaining the peace. In 1027 and later, the Church added the Truce of God, that is, that during certain days and seasons there should be no fighting at all. At first the truce included only Sundays. Later, other days in each week, church festivals and holy seasons like Lent were added, until only about 80 days in each year remained on which private warfare was allowed. Thus the peace of God was intended to protect certain classes at all times, the truce to protect all classes at certain times. The Church was not able to enforce either because of the lawlessness of the nobles. The wife of a noble had many duties to perform, for which she was carefully trained from her early childhood. First of all, she must know how to sew and spin flax and silk, as she made her own clothes, and to a great extent the clothes of her husband. The coarser work, spinning of wool and weaving, was left generally to the servants, but this also was under her direction. Embroidering the so-called tapestries was a favourite occupation, and the completed work decorated the halls of the castles on festive occasions, graced the tournaments, or adorned the churches. On the tapestries were wrought wonderful representations of animals and men, battle scenes, or the adventures of legendary heroes. The Bayeux tapestry, which depicts the conquest of England, is the best known example. In addition, a lady was expected to have some knowledge of medicine and nursing, in order that she might care for the sick in the castle. Finally, she had the general management of the whole household, and during her husband's absence must be ready to take his place. Not infrequently, a lady was compelled to defend the castle. As the daughter was trained for her later duties, so too the son was carefully educated, in order that he might become a valiant knight. From his earliest boyhood he exercised in running, climbing, jumping, riding, swimming, shooting with the bow, and hurling a spear. At about 12 years of age his real education began. It was the custom that sons of nobles should be sent to the castle of the overlord to receive this education. There they served as pages or squires, running errands, serving at table, cleaning the weapons and armour, and attending the lords at tournaments or in battle. They were taught to use different weapons, and were expected to show their skill in horsemanship or in fighting. In addition, they were encouraged to make verses and sing them to their own accompaniment, as this became the fashion toward the end of the 12th century. When the boy became of age, he might be made a knight if he seemed worthy of the honour. For not even a king's son could claim knighthood as a right, and in theory it was conferred only as a reward of merit. It grew out of the old German custom of giving a youth his arms in the public assembly, a symbol of the fact that he had become a man and a member of the tribe. The Church had recognized this custom, and endeavoured to use it as a means of reforming the feudal nobles. To the old German usages it had added Christian rites intended to sanctify the profession of knighthood or chivalry, and to impose some duties upon each knight. It taught that there was a certain resemblance between knighthood and priesthood, as both the knight and the priest had taken vows to aid the Church in its work. The three essentials in the early ceremony were the girding on of the sword, the symbol of his new honour, by some knight, the accolade or blow on the neck, the symbol of freedom, and an exhibition of ability to use the weapons. In time the ceremony became much more complicated, and many religious symbolic rites were added. The arms of the future knight were blessed and placed upon the altar in some church. The candidate took a bath, the symbol of purity, watched his arms during a night spent on his knees in prayer, attended mass, took an oath to fulfil all the duties of chivalry, received his sword and the accolade from a knight, was clad in armour and with the golden spurs by the lords and ladies present, vaulted on horseback, and with his lance in rest charged against the quintain or stuffed mannikin to show his skill. Later the exercises became even more elaborate and more fully religious. Often on the field of battle all formality was dispensed with, and the usages were seldom as elaborate in Germany or England as in France, the especial home of chivalry. Knighthood was usually conferred by the suzerain, and this fact determined to a great extent the duties of a knight, which were practically the same as those of a vassal, but more idealized. The knight ought to be sans reproche, brave, generous, and faithful. He ought to protect the weak, to observe his oath faithfully, and to keep his honour spotless. Chivalry introduced high ideals, but was powerless to enforce them among the turbulent nobles of the age. Deeds of cruelty and perfidy were common, even on the part of the best men. It is only in the later centuries that a Bayard arises. Bayard, 1476 to 1523, was so distinguished by his valour, piety, and magnanimity that he was called le chevalier sans peur et sans reproche. Back to main text. But the ideals of chivalry, inculcated by the Church and sung by the Troubadours, were effective in improving the manners and inciting to a more perfect courtesy. Troubadours, poets of the 12th and 13th centuries, who lived in southern France and northern Italy and sang the praises of chivalry. Back to main text. In the 12th century it became fashionable to play games during leisure hours. Chess, introduced from the Mohammedans, was the greatest favourite. Checkers, backgammon, and dice-throwing were also popular. Dancing was an ever-welcome diversion. In the large castles, dwarfs and jesters or court fools were kept for the amusement of the nobles. The fools were allowed, on account of their folly, an unlimited license in speech, and often belied their reputation by the keenness of their wits, which spared no one. They were generally adorned with a cap and bells, and frequently, like the modern clown, were made ridiculous in appearance by some device, such as shaving half the head, half the beard, and half the moustache. Strolling players who performed acrobatic feats were sometimes admitted to the banquet hall to exhibit their skill. The jongleurs travelled about the country from castle to castle, reciting the poems of the Troubadours. With musical instruments on their backs, they would enter a castle, salute the lord with some poetical address, and then begin, "My lords, be silent if you wish to hear a song such as no other jongleur can sing." Then would follow some long drawn-out narrative in verse, of which the theme might be the death of Roland, the love of Tristan and Isolde, the prowess of the Knights of the Round Table, the capture of Troy, or the deeds of the Crusaders. In these stories one combat or siege follows another. Banquets are described with a detail that demands the mention of each individual dish. Customs and usages are depicted with a photographic minuteness which makes it possible to reproduce accurately many features of the life of a feudal castle. Occasionally, in the enormous mass of poetry written by the Troubadours, there is a real gem, like Aucassin and Nicolette. Many of their tales have been translated from one language to another, and have been retold until they have become a part of the literature of modern nations. Who has not read of Roland and Oliver, King Arthur and his knights, or Parsifal? In the intervals of peace, the nobles engaged in tournaments or mimic warfare as their favourite pastime. At first these were simple fights in the open fields between two companies of knights. In the 13th century they became elaborate entertainments, managed by very strict rules. The Church forbade them in vain, for they were universally popular. The kings of France were not any more successful in repressing them. In the 14th and 15th centuries they reached their greatest splendour, and any especial occasion, such as the marriage of a great lord, was considered a sufficient excuse for a tournament, which would attract knights and adventurers from all directions. Technically, tournaments were battles in which whole bands engaged. Jousts were combats between two knights. One of the reasons for their popularity was that they afforded a great opportunity for making money. Each participant, when conquered, forfeited his horse and arms to his conqueror, and must redeem his own body from captivity. Consequently, the combatants were seldom killed in tournaments, and the same was true of real warfare. The armour protected a knight from many dangers, his value in money as a prisoner from even more. The great carnage on the fields of battle was among the squires and foot soldiers. In tournaments there was less danger to the head than to the purse. An ordinance of the King of France in 1314 forbade tournaments and jousts, because of the great destruction and mortality of horses and sometimes of persons. On the other hand, the love of participating in tournaments frequently ruined a knight's fortune. The nobles were generally in financial straits, because generosity in giving and lavish waste in entertaining were regarded as knightly virtues. Every possible occasion was seized upon for an entertainment, and none was given without providing costly banquets for all who chose to come, and valuable presents for all guests. Prodigality was considered a mark of nobility. At the cry of largesse, the listeners showered money, ornaments, and garments upon the minstrels. Every messenger must be rewarded with a gift. Friends, vassals, and all who came must have occasion to praise the liberality of the knight. This wastefulness kept even the kings and great barons in constant financial difficulties. But the knight who refrained from such a course was despised as a niggard. Amid all this extravagance there was a great lack of many things now considered necessities. The inner walls were hung with rich tapestries or Saracen carpets made at Paris, which were especially prized in the 13th century. But the rooms could not be kept warm in winter. Every poet sings the joys of spring, when the earth gets warm again. At the banquets, the tables groaned under the rich viands, which were served in almost endless profusion, but the knights and ladies ate with their fingers. Footnote: in 1297, the King of England owned only one fork. Forks came into common use only in the 16th century. Back to main text. The same contrast holds true in almost every feature of the life of the nobles. Their prodigality impoverished them. The increasing power of the kings, the growing wealth and influence of the merchants, the changed conditions of life in general after the 13th century, caused the nobles on the continent to lose much of their power. Many sought fortunes by becoming condottieri, or mercenary captains, in Italy or wherever war was being waged. Absorbed in the need of gaining money to maintain their rank, their ideals changed, and the life which has been described passed away. The use of gunpowder in battle finally rendered the knights and their castles equally impotent.